Tonight we chase a puzzle older than any classroom. Achilles legend, soldier, symbol. What did a real war on the Anatolian coast leave behind? And what did singers add later? We'll move between three engines of this story. War as logistics, song as a technology of memory, and power as the user of both. From Hittite tablets that whisper of Ahhiyawa and Wailusa, to the burnt layers of Isalik, to the poets who forged the Iliad. Well, test myth against evidence. If this journey speaks to you, tap like and subscribe. One question for the comments. In Achilles' story, where does truth live in the ground, in the song, or in the way later ages used both? The first part. Night on the Aegean smells like resin, unwet rope. A low hull slides past a headland, its crew watching for the swing of a beacon. Its cargo packed for palaces that eat bronze and story alike. Before Achilles is a hero, he's a function of a system, a world where tin and copper marry in furnaces, where kings trade letters about ports, and where a local quarrel can yank a whole net of obligations tight. Fix the map in your mind. To the east sits a great court that calls itself Hatti. To the west, the island and peninsula world the Hittites label Ahhiyawa, the Mycenaeans. Between them, the straits and coasts of northwestern Anatolia, a landscape of small rulers who must bow to someone. Grain moves north, metal south, wool and oil both ways. Dates to hold: the 13th century BCE for the most important letters, around 1200 BCE for the wider crisis people call the Bronze Age collapse. A scene to start us. A Hittite scribe leans over wet clay. He writes of a place called Wailusa. Many scholars read that as a memory of Troy and of a prince whose loyalty swings with the wind. He writes to a Western great king as to an equal. If that king is the ruler of Ahhiyawa, then Greek speech is standing at an imperial window. Myth loves single combat. The paperwork shows coalition and leverage. What makes war likely in a world like this? Not romance. Logistics. Bronze needs tin, and tin is rare. Crews risk reefs for ingots stamped like loaves. Ports demand dues. A captured harbour defines a tax year. A burned warehouse erases one. If Wailusa sits on a knot of sea roads and overland tracks, holding it means skimming every amphora that passes. The quarrel that later singers place over a woman's name begins, plausibly, over fees, grain, and precedence. Myth versus evidence, quick and clean. Myth: a 10-year siege under a single set of walls. Evidence: letters in the 1200s BCE mention shifting alliances, raids, punitive campaigns, and making friends again. Outcome: not one unbroken decade of war, but repeated shocks that a singer could stack into one storm. For clarity, listen for the stakes. If the straits narrow by blockade, by tribute, by garrison palaces in the west pay more for copper and tin. If the inland grain routes hiccup, coastal garrisons go hungry. If a local lord defects, a neighbour's taxes double overnight. Every palace runs on surplus and promises. Each promise rides a ship. The system's beauty is also its weakness. Pull the right cord, and distance collapses into conflict. Another scene. Icon: a young archer from a town near the Troad ruts his sandals into a rampart. He's not a hero. He counts shots. He knows his nobles hunt boar for sport and glory. But he also knows why the barley in his village went dear last spring. A convoy missed the harbour, and the landlord called in debts. When he strings his bow, his private hope is not immortal fame. It is boiled grain through winter, scale that hope to 1,000 households, and you have the engine of campaign season. The Eastern Court, for balance. A Hittite envoy recites names: Lucca, Seha River land, Milawanda the last a form of Miletus. Each name is a policy problem wrapped around a coastline. Every promise to a vassal costs barley or bronze. Every breach invites raiders. An equal in the west offers mediation with a sweetener. Return of seized people. A hand fasting between elites. A shared right in a coastal shrine. The clay is careful. It records agreements because it expects to be used as evidence when those agreements fray. Numbers to anchor the year. One long ship might carry 30 to 50 men and the season's worth of grain for them. A palace needs tons, not sacks. and couriers to pace distances that take days by road and hours by fair wind. The 10 years in later song works as cadence the reality breathes, by sailing seasons and harvests. A quiet truth, a single bad Nile or Anatolian drought can do more to armies than a spear. Now put Achilles back into the frame. In a world that measures rank at feasts and counts gifts aloud, a man who refuses to fight is more than moody. He breaks the flow of favors and exposes the math beneath the ritual. That is why his anger matters in the poem, and why a version of such a man likely mattered in life. Warriors who are also stakeholders force kings to negotiate. Power is a ledger, not just a spear. Myth versus evidence. Second bumper. Myth, a coalition of all Greece under one high king. Evidence, many palaces, Mycenae, Pylos, Tyrants, Thebes, each strong, each jealous letters that treat Ahio as ruler as great, but not universally obeyed. Outcome, think federation when convenient, rivalry when not. A singer later smooths that into one throne for the sake of plot. Why would later ages keep retelling this? Because the template is reusable. Control a strait, tax a cargo, promise a war, publish a peace. The Iliad's human geometry, honor against payroll, rage against ration makes sense to any court that pays soldiers and any city that feeds a port. When Alexander visits a supposed tomb of Achilles in the 300s BCE, he's reading himself into a gnome role, conqueror borrowing a myth that already knows how logistics work. One last scene for this part. In a smoky hall centuries after the fighting, a singer takes a deep breath and begins a line in a meter that remembers oars. Around him sit men who rule storehouses, they hear their world in the beat. The singer compresses raids and treaties into one war for Troy, because everyone in the room knows what that means. Ships paid, allies counted, gods satisfied, grain secured. The story is entertainment, yes, it is also a map. Why this matters before we open the tablets and the trenches. If you hear Achilles only as a door, Troy shrinks to a courtyard. If you hear him inside a network, you can test the song against cargo lists, drought years, and letters hardened in fire. Then, when you find a burnt layer or a line on clay, it clicks into a living system, not a museum case. You're at part 1 of 6, the Bronze Age network. So far we set the system kings, cargo, and coasts, and we mark the stakes. Hold a harbor, control a year. Next in part 2, we read the documents themselves, Hittite letters that name places and powers, and what they do and do not let us claim. The second part, open a drawer in a ruined palace, and history sounds like fingernails on clay. In Hattusa, the Hittite capital scribes pressed reeds into wet tablets and baked their politics hard enough to last 3,000 years. Among those tablets, letters that speak to a Western great king mention places called Wailusa and Toroisa, and argue over ports that feel very close to the Troad. Many scholars read Ahioa as the Achaean world, Wailusa as a memory of W. Ilias, Troy, and Milawanda as Miletus. Not unanimity, but a strong majority view. A scene to hold. A scribe lifts a tablet by its edges. The Tawagolawa letter, late 13th century BCE, addresses the king of Ahioa as brother, a title Hittites reserve for peers, like Egypt or Babylon. The issue on the table is not romance, it is jurisdiction on the Anatolian coast and a certain runaway named Piyamaradu, who keeps testing borders. Let us make friendship between us, the letter says in diplomatic Akkadian. Translation, share influence, or we both bleed. Myth versus evidence, clean. Myth, one throne commands all Greece to a single war. Evidence, Ahioa is treated with respect. But as another great king among several, the coast is a patchwork of vassals and rivals. Outcome, think negotiated coalitions, not military unanimity. Another tablet, another knot. The so-called Milawata letter likely concerns Milawanda, Miletus, and rearranges who guards which ports. It also hints that Wailusa changed hands, without endless siege, settlement, pressure, a swap of allegiances. Then a treaty often linked with Muwatalli names a ruler, Alexander of Wailusa. The name teases the ear. To some it echoes Alexandros, Paris. To others it's coincidence. The safe read, a local prince under Hittite horizon whose status mattered, because his hill and harbour did. The clay has a tone, measured, practical, sometimes weary. You took my merchants, return them. Your man raided my land, punish him. Let us repair friendship. These are not lines from an epic, but they are the scaffolding epics stand on. When a singer centuries later compresses years of letters into a single chorus, he's sorting a filing cabinet into a story. Remember, quick anchors for the year. Dates cluster in the 13th century BCE. The archive is at Bozki, Hattusa in central Anatolia. Tablets are written in Hittite and diplomatic Akkadian. Names to keep straight: Ahiawa, Achaean sphere; Wailusa, likely Troy; Milawanda, Miletus; Seha, river land somewhere SW Anatolia; Lucca, roughly Lycia. Each name is less a pin on a map than a contract someone must honor. A small voice returns the scribe again, now sanding a tablet's edge smooth before sealing it in a clay envelope. He thinks like a bookkeeper. Tally the wrong, offer a remedy, stamp the king's seal. The envelope will break only when someone disputes the memory. This is what bureaucracy does in an age before parchment. It petrifies promises. Myth versus evidence, second bumper. Myth Helen is the trigger. Evidence letters center on ports, fugitives, tribute, and who commands whom. Outcome: people can fight about people, but the paperwork fights about logistics. Why does any of this matter to Achilles? Because his poem is obsessed with status, gifts, and who honors terms. When Agamemnon violates the gift economy in the Iliad, the narrative cracks open that anger makes sense in a world where every oath has a price and every price is recorded. The tablets show a culture trained to count numbers briefly. A single tablet might log the return of dozens of captives. A treaty lists sanctuaries and fines by weight of silver. Travel time matters: days, by road between coastal towns, and Hittite inland courts hours, by favorable wind over narrow seas. A 10-year war in song is a memory of repeated campaigns spaced by sailing seasons and negotiations. One last document seen. An envoy reads the Alexandru Treaty aloud in a courtyard. The clauses start dull: borders, tribute, hostages. Then the promises turn religious. Gods of Hatti and Wailusa are called as witnesses. The political lesson is simple and hard to break. Law is sacred when both sides say it is. This habit survives collapses better than walls. So the thread tightens. The tablets do not hand us a photograph of Homer's Troy, but they sketch a network where a Troy-like city sits at a pressure point and where Achaean power mattered enough to be treated as equal when it helped. You're at part 2 of 6, the clay letters. We've moved from a system to its paperwork, names, treaties, and the sober grammar of power. Next, in part 3, we walk the trench at Isalic burnt layers, walls, and what the ground will and won't say. The third part, walk the trench where a hill once wore a crown. Hisarlik rocky, wine stung. Looking down on the Dardanelles is a stack of cities, not one. Archaeologists number them like floors, Troii to Troics. 4 our ear, 2 layers matter most for the late Bronze Age, Troy VI and Troy V. Think of them as versions of the same town under different weather, first prosperous and proud, then cramped and weary. Picture the walls of Troy VI, ashlar blocks, sloping outward like a hand bracing a door, with projecting towers and a gate ramp you would feel in your cabs. This is not a village, it's a small capital that expects visitors to be impressed and, if necessary, kept out. Inside, big megaron houses, courtyards, storage rooms. Earthquakes visit. You can read them in broken wall lines and tumbled stones. One quake, late in Troy's life, seems to have done what battering rams could not. It opened seams. After the shaking, people patched and packed. Troy Via grows out of those repairs. Tighter houses, more storage jars sunk into floors, lanes that feel narrower in the dark. That is the look of a town bracing for trouble. More mouths, less space, provisions close at hand. In the destruction layer of Via, excavators have found sling bullets, arrowheads, and scorch signs of fighting and fire. Date anchors drift within a generation. but many scholars place this ruin late in the 1200s BCE or around 1180 BCE, right in the storm season of the wider collapse. Myth versus evidence. Quick. Myth. One perfect wall stands for 10 years. Evidence. A strong fortification VI damaged by quake, followed by a more crowded phase VIA that ends violently. Outcome. A city suffered both nature and war. Good kindling for a poem that compresses shocks into a single siege. A small scene helps. A dig hand lifts a fist-sized sling bullet from the soil. Chalk white against damp brown. It still fits the palm as if made yesterday. Nearby, a storage jar pithos sits buried to its shoulder in a floor. You can see the logic. Staples underground for coolness and safety missiles ready. When neighbors stop being neighbors. Numbers for the year. Some outer walls of VI stand several meters thick at the base towers, projects at intervals like knuckles. House blocks run tight, with partition walls that tell you families expanded inward, not outward. In VIA destruction, bones and tools lie where they fell, not the careful emptiness of an evacuation, but the clatter of a fight. Now the cautionary tale. In the 1870s, Heinrich Schliemann cut to fast and to deep, finding a cache of gold. He named Priam's treasure, but in a much earlier layer Troy, centuries before our story. Later archaeology slowed down, mapped stratigraphy, and learned to let pottery talk. That method matters for our ears. We want the right layer for the right century. Another myth versus evidence bumper. Myth. Troy was a single citadel on a lonely hill. Evidence. The lower town spread beyond the fort, with traces of ditches and posts that suggest a larger footprint in the late Bronze Age. Outcome. The city is more than the crown, it's the clothing around it. Fields, workshops, huts, pens. Define terms as we go. Hisarlik is the modern name of the mound in northwestern Turkey. Troy V and Via are archaeologists' labels for late subphases. V likely ends in earthquake, Via ends in burning and breakage. Burnt layers don't tell you who held the torch, but they do tell you a clock ticked fast near the end. A brief return to the sea. From Troy's heights, the Dardanelles are a silver ribbon. Control the gate between Aegean and Black Sea, and you price everything that floats. That geography explains attention, the soil explains anxiety. A town at a choke point cannot grow without becoming a prize. One more scene for balance. A young woman in Via stands in a doorway with a grinding stone, listening to shouts near the gate. The storage jar under her floor is full, the jar in the neighbor's room is not. That difference is politics on a street scale. When the gate fails, debts and promises fell with it. In the dirt, her grinding stone will look domestic, but tonight it's part of supply. Myth versus evidence. Third pass. Myth. Greeks build a horse. Gate opens, city falls. Evidence. We have a violent end layer, not a wooden model. We have fire and missiles, not a diagram of trickery. Outcome. The horse is a symbol that encodes breach by cunning into a single image. The ground only guarantees a breach. Why this matters before we leave the trench. If the main destruction at Via sits near 1200 BCE, then the soil offers a town that collapsed at the right time for singers to remember a war at Troy generations later. If, instead, we insisted on an earlier level, we would be singing to the wrong century. The virtue here is modesty. The earth lets us say a warlike end near the right dates, not the Iliad proved. That is enough to keep the story honest and the stakes high. You're at part 3 of 6, the ground at Hisarlik. We've walked the walls, felt the quake, and read the burnt layer like a verdict. Up next, part 4 turns from earth to voice. How singers forged raids and treaties into the Iliad's rhythm, and why meter is a memory machine. The fourth part. Begin with a room, not a battlefield. Smoke, a low fire. A singer with a lyre. He draws breath, and the line clicks into place. Dactylic hexameter. A rhythm that keeps its own step even when the mind wanders. Form your slide in like fitted stones. Swift-footed Achilles, rosy-fingered dawn. They aren't clicks, they're tools. In a world before paper, you build memory from meter. Myth versus evidence. The song feels like one poet at one desk. Evidence says otherwise. Generations of our wood was shaped and reshaped stories allowed writing arrives late, around the 8th century BCE, and fixes one long version out of many. Outcome: the Iliad is a river caught in a jar. A quick scene. The singer marks the beat with his thumb on the soundboard and launches a type scene arming, counsels, supplication, each with stock lines that can expand or tighten on demand. The technique matters. It lets a performer track a plot across hours without notes. This is not laziness, it's architecture. Count something once, so the ear trusts you. The Iliad runs to roughly 15,000 lines. That's too big to memorize verbatim in our sense. It's perfect to remember as patterns, episodes, and themes you can stitch in live performance. When later rhapsodes recite in city festivals, the themes become roads between fixed landmarks. Now bring Achilles back in. His wrath is not just emotion, it's a test of the gift economy the song describes. Stock epithets do double duty here: godlike, breaker of ranks, assigning status, while keeping the meter smooth. When Agamemnon breaks the rules of gifts and honor, the singer has a ready kit, a council scene, a quarrel, a ritual oath. The craft makes the politics audible. Myth versus evidence again. Myth: Homer invents a world. Evidence: the poem preserves Bronze Age flavors, boar tusk helmets, great shields even as it wears later clothes, iron blades, hoplite tactics peeking in. Outcome: the song is a palimpsest, it remembers backward and forward at once. Another scene, centuries later. A rhapsode in Athens trades verses with a partner at the Panathenaea, each taking a turn. The baton passed on a formula everyone knows. Competition sharpens memory. City authority shapes canon. A once fluid story becomes a civic possession. Names and numbers, sparingly. Hexameter is 6 beats, each line falling into a pattern that welcomes certain word lengths and resists others. That pressure produces the famous epithets, not decoration, but the right key for the lock. About the 8th century BCE gives us the right horizon for writing to step in. The poem's long life in performance explains its later unity. A final, quiet scene. A boy learns to chant a catalogue of ships. It sounds like a list, but it works like a map. Regions, captains, numbers, the rhythm forces order onto memory. When he grows up, he will hear logistics in the music without knowing that's what he's hearing. Why this matters before we march out of the hall. If we understand song as a memory machine, then the poem's 10 years, its fixed epithets, its repeating scenes stop being flaws. They are the operating system. That system can carry news from a late Bronze Age coast into an early Iron Age city without dropping the thread. You're at part 4 of 6, Voice and Method. We've watched singers turn raids and treaties into rhythm and rules. Next, part 5 asks how power used that memory. Alexander at a tomb, Rome claiming Trojan blood, and the medieval habit of making nations from stories. The 5th part, begin at the straits at first light. A young king steps off a ship, garlands in hand. He walks up a low, grassy mound above the Hellespont and leaves a wreath for Achilles. His companion honors Patroclus. He runs a race in armor along the ridge, then says the line later writers will remember. Achilles was lucky to find a friend like Patroclus and a poet like Homer. The year is 334 BCE, and Alexander is making policy in the language of myth. Before he marches inland, he borrows a hero and with him a script for glory that his army already knows by heart. Myth versus evidence. Clean. Myth: those are the heroes' true tombs. Evidence: the mounds at Sigeone and nearby sites are ancient, but their identities were already part of local tradition and politics in Alexander's time. Outcome: the gesture matters more than the geology. The visit declares that conquest will wear epic clothes. Follow the gesture into the city he frees, Ilion, the later town on the hill people call Troy. Alexander promises a new temple for Athena and tax breaks for the locals. He stages sacrifice, he lets the story circulate. A practical king understands that roads, garrisons, and cults belong in the same budget. If soldiers march with a song in their ears, they march farther. Shift west and a little forward in time. Rome wants a pedigree that makes sense of its iron discipline and its taste for conquest. The solution is narrative engineering. If Greeks descend from the winners at Troy, then Romans can descend from the survivors. Aeneas, son of Venus, carries his father on his back, and his household gods in his arms he sells, wanders, and plants a seed that will become Rome. The Augustan age commissions a masterpiece out of that outline. Virgil writes the Aeneid in the 20s BCE, yoking Rome's civil wars to a usable past and a calm future. The poem crowns the Julio-Claudian house with Trojan light. Myth versus evidence again. Myth, literal descent, an unbroken chain from Priam's court to the Palatine Hill. Evidence, colonists, migrants, and a tangled web of Italic peoples made Rome Trojan blood, is a political fiction with ritual effects. Outcome, fiction that cities believe becomes infrastructure. Ilion receives Roman patronage coins, dedications, and pilgrimages follow the poem's path. A scene to hold for the ear. An Augustan priest lays a laurel branch at an altar, while a magistrate reads from a new copy of the Aeneid. Children memorize lines as they learn their letters. The city paints its future on a wall with myth as primer. When standards captured from Parthia return, Augustus stages their homecoming in a Trojan key. Aeneas' patience becomes imperial patience. Virgil's hexameters become a civic metronome. Another road carries the story north. In the 12th century, a clerk in Britain writes a grand origin story. Geoffrey of Monmouth's Brutus of Troy sails west, founds New Troy on the Thames, and gives London a foundation older than Rome. Across the Channel, Frankish chronicles adopt Francus, a Trojan prince, as ancestor. Venice sometimes threads its own line back to the burning city to justify a maritime destiny. In each case, the scaffold is familiar. An ancient fall confers dignity on a new rise. Myth versus evidence. Medieval edition. Myth. Nations of families stretching back to a single heroic hearth. Evidence. Identities in medieval Europe are layered. Roman law, Christian rite, local languages, feudal bonds. Outcome. The Trojan frame serves as a shared story that ties past to power. Chronicles perform the work of charter poets, do the work of policy. Return to the Straits for a last glance to the east. When Ottoman armies moved through the Troad in the 15th century, court histories record a sultan standing among fallen stones and pronouncing a reversal that he avenges ancient Trojans against Greeks. Whether the remark is apocryphal, less important than its function, the site still lends authority to a conquest. Across centuries, both heirs of Rome and their rivals speak fluently in the same epic vocabulary. Power uses memory in three quiet ways. First, it builds places to stage remembrance tombs, temples, festivals, so that story has an address. Second, it funds the copy, the book, the scroll, the inscription, so that story does not fray. Third, it domesticates the myth by tying it to laws and taxes. After Alexander, Ilion gains privileges. After Augustus, Trojan ancestry becomes part of state ritual. After Geoffrey, a king can claim a map older than his neighbor's maps and rule with a clearer conscience. Numbers to steady the picture. Alexander's visit sits within a campaign that moves thousands of soldiers and tons of grain. The garland is a minute in a season of logistics. The Aeneid runs 12 books. It took years to compose and revise, and was read aloud in parts before it was finished. Geoffrey's chronicle spreads by dozens of manuscripts and becomes a staple of courts that want lineages you can recite. Each number traces a budget line, time, copies, mouths. Bring Achilles back into frame. Carefully. Alexander does not copy Achilles' rage, he copies Achilles' brand, speed, audacity, and a court poet's guarantee that deeds will be remembered. Rome does not claim Achilles, it claims the other side, turning survival into virtue. Medieval kings do not claim the duel, they claim the inheritance. In every case, power chooses which shelf to stand on in the epic library. Myth versus evidence. One last time for this part. Myth. The poem controls the world. Evidence. The world selects from the poem. Alexander honors one hero, Rome elevates another. Medieval clerks switch parentage to suit the moment. Outcome. Epics are toolkits. Their gift to power is optionality. A short, human scene to end. A soldier in Alexander's line touches the mound's grass and thinks of home. A Roman boy copies armor virum cono until his hand cramps, then looks up at an arch where a prince has carved his name. A monk in Britain jokes that if everyone is Trojan, no one is, then he writes another page. None of them is wrong. They are doing what cities do, make themselves longer by borrowing older light. Why this matters before we close the circle in part 6. We are measuring not only what might have happened on a hill, but what people did with that possibility. The song became a passport. It let armies and laws cross borders with a story ahead of them to soften the gate. Understanding that use clarifies our last question. What of Achilles survives for us not as lineage, but as method? You're at part 5 of 6, Power and Use. We watched Alexander crown a mound, Rome crown a poem, and medieval courts crown themselves with Trojan names. Next, part 6 asks, what remains when we set legend and lay side by side how to hear Achilles now, with evidence on the table and the story still singing. The 6th part, return to the question that opened this journey, what really burned and what survived. To answer it for Achilles, you have to keep 3 clocks running at once. One counts cargo and kings, the late Bronze Age network that made conflict likely. One keeps time in song meter, type scenes, and the gift economy of honor that poetry encodes. One ticks in palaces and chancelleries how power adopts, edits, and deploys a story. Set them together and the outline sharpens. A warlike end near the right century on a hill that mattered, a poem that remembers backward and forward, and a chain of later readers who turn their memory into policy. Begin where earth and ink meet. In a gallery lighted for preservation, a Hittite tablet sits under glass. Its surface looks like dried riverbed. Cuneiform wedges pressed by a careful hand 13 centuries before our era. It mentions Wilusa and a prince under oaths. It negotiates friendship the way ports negotiate fees. Across town, a trench at Isarlik holds the negative of that precision. Toppled stones, a battered gay tramp, sling bullets chalk-white against brown soil. One record was baked on purpose, the other by accident. Together they spell a possibility. Not one decade of single combat, but repeated shocks at a choke point where sea and road squeeze. Myth versus evidence. Clean. Myth. Achilles proves or disproves Troy all by himself. Evidence. The archive and the ground talk about ports, princes, raids, and repairs they do not pronounce on one hero. Outcome. The hero is best read as a lens, not a fingerprint. He makes the system visible. Now listen to the room with the lyre again. A singer breathes a line with the weight of an oar-stroke hexameter, arranges memory into beats the body can carry. He has a kit for anger, a kit for treaty, a kit for loss. When he names Achilles swift-footed, he isn't just flattering, he's fitting a key into the lock of a meter that will hold the story steady while the night lengthens. Later, when rhapsodes trade passages in a city festival, the seams between their parts work like jetties on a coast. They guide listeners from one safe inlet to the next. The poem becomes a harbour for meanings that shift with each recital, but stay within sight of certain headlands. Myth versus evidence. Second pass. Myth. A single author wrote a single book on a single desk. Evidence. Generations of performance-shaped episodes, long before writing caught them around the 8th century BCE. And the written text we have is a codification of that fluent craft. Outcome. Think of Homer as the name of a tradition with signature features, not as a solitary scribe. Power arrives, speaking the same language with different aims. Alexander crowns a mound in 334 BCE. Claiming speed and audacity from Achilles, Brand Augustus crowns a poem 2.5 centuries later. Claiming patience and order from Aeneas. Medieval clerks crown lineages, sewing Trojan ancestry into national clothes that courts know how to wear. Each move edits the song. Rage when you need momentum, endurance when you need stability, pedigree when you need consent. Epics are toolkits. Power selects. So what survives for us? And how do we use it without lying to it? 3 answers hold up better than idols. First, Geography survives, the Troad's placement on the Dardanelles, the logic of a lower town around a citadel, the appetite of empires for choke points. Second, method survives, the habit of counting and witnessing in clay, of layering and dating in soil, of building arguments the way singers build lines repeatable, testable, shareable. Third, a style of meaning survives, the poem's insistence that gifts, status, and promises are not decoration, but infrastructure. If a leader breaks the ledger, even a near immortal refuses to row, that is not just myth, it is management. Numbers, sparingly, to steady the year. The likely destruction of Troy Veer clusters near the late 1200s BCE or of around 1180 BCE. The Tawagola letter and related tablets belong to the 13th century BCE. The Iliad's fix in writing horizon sits about the 8th century BCE. Alexander on the Mound is 334 BCE. Augustus commissions the Aeneid in the 20s BCE. These are not trivia, they are buoys. Without them, the current of enthusiasm carries us onto reefs of wishful thinking. A scene to pull the threads. Imagine a long table. On it, a sling bullet from Isarlik, a baked tablet from Boski, papyrus copy of Homer, a coin from Ilion stamped under Roman patronage, a medieval codex tracing a royal family back to Troy. Around the table sit three people who have been walking with us. A dig hand with soil under her nails, a trained singer who can still chant, a catalogue, a clerk who can read Akkadian signs out loud. They do not compete, they collaborate. Each object makes more sense in the presence of the others. The bullet means a fight. The tablet means a contract. The papyrus means a memory technique. The coin means a policy. The codex means a claim. The story of Achilles lives in the arrangement. Myth versus evidence. Final bumper. Myth. Either it all happened as sung or none of it happened at all. Evidence. A warlike end at the right time, documents that frame the coast as contested, a poem that stabilizes a network into a legend, later users that turn legend into law. Outcome. Certainty is a false idle, coherence is enough. We can say what probably happened and how those probabilities were used. Why tell it this way now? Because the stakes have not changed as much as we think. Port still price passage. Leaders still seek brand and blessing. Audiences still need mnemonic machines to carry complex truths across noisy rooms. The danger is not myth itself. It is myth without method, the urge to make a single fire explain a library, a single duel explain a decade, a single tomb explain a landscape. The antidote is craft, dates where they matter, definitions on first mention, metaphors on a short leash, and a regular return to our 3 clocks cargo. Song, power. One more human measure before we close. Picture a child any century memorizing a few lines. He cannot see Hattusa, Hisarlik, or Rome. He can hear cadence. The cadence becomes a shelf. On that shelf, we place what we can actually know. That a coast drew rivals, that the ground broke and burned, that people organized memory with exquisite skill, that later states put those memories to work. In the gap between line and layer, a hero's name floats to heavy for one man, just right for a system. That is why the name lasts. You're at part 6 of 6. Aftermath and method. We have not proven Homer's plot. We have done something rarer. We have shown how evidence and song can be read together without stealing from either. If this hour lit something for you, if a tablet felt less mute, if a wall felt less lonely, if a line felt more serious, tell us in the comments where you think Achilles lives, in earth, in verse, or in the choices power keeps making with both.